Welcome back to This is a Commander channel, where this is a Commander channel, and today I'm going to talk about Commander Tough Rules and Cool Interactions, episode 36. Today's episode is going to cover what happens when you have a triggered ability that has you possibly repeating an action multiple times and how that interacts with certain triggered abilities and static abilities. So tonight, I was just at a judge conference, and after the primary conference itself, a bunch of us headed over to their local game store, and they closed early just so that we could bring in a bunch of food and eat and play some games, both Magic and non-Magic. Shout out to Knighthood Games in Cookeville, Tennessee for being such great hosts. Well, we had some L2s and even an L3 judge was there, but on the other end, we had some people there who were aspiring judges. They were still working their way up towards L1, and maybe a few of them had even completed their Rules Advisor's test, which is a light test of your rules knowledge and understanding, but it isn't all too deep. During one of the games, I saw a player that had played a Cultivator Colossus, and even some of those players that had completed their RA test were thrown off just a bit by how this card's triggered ability would interact with one of the cards that was on the battlefield. So that got me thinking of this episode and how I could even further complicate some of this scenario. So, here's the scenario. You control Ancient Green Warden as well as AC Tyrant of Gyre Strait. The relevant text on the Green Warden is that it has a static ability that says, if a land entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. And then the relevant text on AC is that it has a triggered ability that says, whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. You then play your Cultivator Colossus, which has a triggered ability that says, when Cultivator Colossus enters the battlefield, you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped. If you do, draw a card and repeat this process. Once your Cultivator Colossus ETBs, you start to resolve his trigger, and so you put a land onto your battlefield tapped. And then you draw 4 cards total, 2 because of the part of the Colossus that says, if you do, draw a card and repeat this process. And you get an additional trigger from that due to the Ancient Green Warden. And then also AC has you draw a card because of the whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card, trigger, and that is of course also getting the additional trigger from the Green Warden. Then the process repeats, letting you put a land card onto the battlefield and draw 4 more cards, and repeat and repeat and repeat. This is how all of these cards interact with each other, right? Sadly, no, and yes, but also no. So let's dive in. I'll start with the part that I would say is the most wrong part of this scenario. The Cultivator Colossus does have a triggered ability, but it is one single triggered ability, and it does not set up any additional triggered abilities within the card itself. In the rules of Magic, there are 3 words and 3 words only that signify a triggered ability. These words are when, whenever, and at. When, whenever, at. But the word if does not mean that we're doing a triggered ability, and when we look at the wording on the Colossus, we can see that it says, if you do, draw a card and repeat this process. Because of this, the static ability on the Green Warden will not see any triggered ability happening from the land entering the battlefield. Now, I did say no, yes, and no earlier. So part of that whole draw 4 total cards thing per land entering was true. What part? So let's get into the part that earned a yes. AC does have a triggered ability that is triggered by a land entering the battlefield, and AEC is indeed a permanent. So that means that the Green Warden's static ability will cause you to have an additional AC card draw trigger. But there's a slight problem for when you get those two cards drawn from AC, and that's why I said that second no earlier in the video. So now let's dive into that. This video is long enough for now, so there will for sure be an episode in the future that goes much deeper into this. But for now, just know that in Magic, once you start to resolve a spell or ability from the stack, you will resolve all of it. And anything that triggers because of what thing or things happened during its resolution will all have their triggers placed onto the stack. But they will not begin to resolve until this current spell or ability has fully finished resolving. So, how does that apply to this Cultivator Colossus and AEC situation? As I said earlier in the video, the if you do draw a card and repeat this process, part of the Colossus's triggered ability is just that. It is a part of it. No new trigger. Each time you repeat this action, it is just still part of one singular triggered ability still resolving. This means that, in this situation, you will want to keep track of how many lands you're putting out onto the battlefield with the Colossus, like maybe just putting them into play tapped off to the side in their own little stack. And that way, once it is fully resolved and you've no longer put a new land out onto the battlefield, then you can easily pick up that stack of lands and count them and see just how many times your AEC has triggered, which each of those will of course have an additional trigger due to the Green Warden. So in this scenario, let's say you played the Cultivator Colossus and put out a land a total of 5 times. This means at the end of it all, you will have drawn 5 cards in total from the Cultivator Colossus, and then once it finishes, you'll be able to draw 10 cards from AEC. Of note, her trigger is a May ability, which means you could technically draw anywhere between 0 and 10 collectively from all the triggers. So the total is 15 possible card draws. This is all very important for the game, as the thing causing Cultivator Colossus's ability to keep repeating is that you must put a land from your hand into play, and you're far more likely to keep hitting lands to put into play if you're drawing 4 cards or even 2 cards rather than just the 1 each time you repeat that process. Before I close out this video, I do want to add in one final bonus interaction that would actually change how the Cultivator Colossus's triggered ability would work to increase your cards drawn and therefore increase your odds of repeating it. A card like Teferi's Ageless Insight has a replacement effect that reads, if you would draw a card, except for the first one you draw in each of your draw steps, draw 2 cards instead. This is a replacement effect that modifies the ability on the Colossus so that each time you would draw a card, you would instead draw 2 cards. But this would not make you double up on the number of times repeated. It doesn't make you repeat that process twice, only that you draw twice as many cards. Anyhow, that's all I've got for today's episode. As always, I hope that all of you have found this video to be entertaining at least, and I hope that even a few of you maybe learned something about these crazy rules in this great game of Magic. Have a good one. Ta-ta!